This is Dave again at AFX Title. One of our websites is called easementsearch.com, and we do a lot of research on property easements. And one of the questions that comes up is, what is the value or worth of a property easement? The value of the underlying property a lot of times can be determined by comparable sales, what the property sold for, or what similar properties are selling for. But the easement, even though it's a distinct property right, sometimes it's difficult to determine what the value is. A lot of times the way that it's determined is looking at what is the grantor of that easement actually losing or giving up. If a property is granting an easement, maybe ingress and egress across the property, maybe it's a place for utility lines to go underground, what is the value of that property being reduced because of that easement? The other way to look at it is, what is the grantee gaining? Is an adjacent property gaining access from a landlocked situation by having a driveway across an adjacent property? What is the value of that? One way to determine the value is to do a full appraisal on the grantee property without the easement, and then doing a appraisal on that property with the easement in place, so there's egress and ingress to the property. Once you do that, you can tell the difference and say, hey, the property value increased by $40,000 because of this driveway allowing access. That will determine the possible value of the easement. Comparing that with what the grantor property is losing, and you can get a good idea. You can also look at similar easements which may have been granted, although because easement creation is not a high volume or a popular thing to do, you may not find an identical or similar easement, especially recently, to compare it to. One thing you can look at is, are there appraisals on properties which show an easement and have a plus or minus adjustment on it. Maybe a property has been appraised nearby that has a similar easement, especially if it's a utility easement that affects all properties. That appraisal may have a plus or minus adjustment to show how much that appraiser created a value, plus or minus, having that easement on that property. In some cases, an easement against a property may add value. For example, if you're giving an easement to a public sewer or water system as opposed to a well and septic, it may add value to the property because now they have access to that public utility. That may make it a positive for the grantor. What does the grantee of the easement hope to gain on their property? Again, if it's something where there's a driveway allowing access, they hope to gain use of the property, maybe to build a house on it, maybe something else. Some of that future value might be subjective, but again, a good appraisal will let you do that. Another comparison is to see if that type of easement is common on surrounding properties. If every property has a power line going over it, except for the subject property, putting that easement on it is really not going to affect it that much because it's expected in that area. And the last thing to look at is there any danger of eminent domain? So if the property does not have an easement and the owner is maybe unwilling to grant one, can the county or city or state come in and say, we're putting the easement anyways under eminent domain powers, and maybe not have as much compensation as you would negotiating with the utility company or whoever? So that's another area where that eminent domain danger might factor in to the value. So looking at easements, they do affect the property that's a subject property, the surrounding properties. Coming up on the value has a few different approaches, but looking at surrounding properties, what easements they have might be a good direction to start to determine what that value might be.